So I'm going to give you 2 science points, 2 morality, or rather immorality points, and 2 ways forward for climate policy. To start with, let's look at this picture by the Dutch artist Maurits Escher. You're all familiar with Escher's work because you know that picture of the hand drawing itself. And that's just one of many clever pictures that he did. He didn't know it when he did this 60 years ago, but he was drawing here a picture of Australia's environmental and science policy. What we have here is any little bit of this looks quite sensible. So this might be the Australian Research Council. Looks quite sensible in itself. But no matter which stairway you follow, you end up at an impasse. It just doesn't add up. It ends in a blank doorway or the geometry changes. Australia's environmental policy, particularly, and to a lesser degree science policy, is just like this picture. It completely lacks coherence. And that's going to be something I'm going to talk about later. Okay, coming to the 2 science points. And I've chosen these out of about a dozen. As Stuart says, how do we test the hypothesis of dangerous anthropogenic global warming? Well, there's about 10 simple empirical tests. Stuart's just given you one, and I note that the hypothesis failed that test. I'm now going to give you 2 more, and I stress these are selected out of a whole bunch of other tests which come to a similar conclusion. So what we are testing then is the temperature unusually warm today, because we're constantly told that it is because of these greenhouse gases. This is a graph of the last 11,000 years of temperature above the Greenland ice cap. It comes from an ice core. And what you see, the top graph is the temperature in blue. And what you see is it's always changing up and down. But overall, there's no doubt that there is a decrease in temperature, in fact, of about 2 degrees in Greenland over the last 10,000 years. So here we are at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. The dotted red line there is the little bit of warming we had in the late 20th century, nothing unusual about it at all. And we are actually at the moment on a long-term cooling trend. If you look really carefully, just in there above that red thing, you can see a lot of little angels dancing around the head of that dash. That's the public discussion, which is ludicrous, about whether last year was the warmest over the last 150 years. When they say this is the warmest year ever, ever means since we've had thermometers. That means about the last 150 years. Climate is defined by the meteorologists as 30 years of average weather at a site. So 150 years of temperature record divided by 30 is 5. So these people are telling you to reorganize the energy economy of the world on the basis of 5 climate data points. It is absurd. It's also scandalous. So when you look at it in proper context, we are on a cooling trend. Even more interestingly, this is carbon dioxide as measured in an Antarctic ice core, and carbon dioxide mixes in the atmosphere in about a year, so that's fine. This is a global signal. And you see quite clearly that carbon dioxide increased by 20 parts per million. Over the same 8,000 years, that temperature decreased. This is a direct test of the theory of dangerous global warming caused by carbon dioxide. And the theory fails it. No ifs, no buts. You don't need a PhD. You don't need to be a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. Every first-year geology or meteorology student around the world, thousands of them, are taught these facts. They're in every science textbook. You've never, ever seen them in the Sydney Morning Herald. So 2 myths. Atmospheric temperature is unusually warm today. That is simply a lie, completely untrue. More carbon dioxide will necessarily cause dangerous warming? Well, a good hypothesis. Here's the test for it. Fail. It's a myth. Second science fact. Carbon dioxide is also very high today and getting worse because this gentleman bought a second SUV. Could you believe it? So imagine all the carbon dioxide. Okay, well, here's a graph now. I'm a geologist, so I'm relaxing because I've now got 500 million years of Earth history, and now we really can start to see some genuine environmental changes through time. And these various estimates in different colours are different ways of reconstructing carbon dioxide. And the scale over here is in parts per million. And so today, sitting in here about a quarter of the way to 1,000 parts per million, that's about 280 parts per million, and that was the level before the Industrial Revolution. It's now 400 parts per million, and yes, indeed, it is the gentleman with the second SUV and the rest of you that have contributed to that climb in carbon dioxide. So it has increased, no doubt about it. But we're down here, that's modern value. Now, this is the record of carbon dioxide through the last 500 million years. 500 million years ago, this period of time, CM, stands for Cambrian. That's the name of a geological period when the first multicellular animals had shells, hard parts, little carbonate hard parts. And they look very like the organisms running around today's seas. Little shellfish, little worms, a little snail here, and this is an extinct group of sponges. So, of course, they're not exactly the same species as running around today's seas, but they have the same basic physiology. And from the sediments that they occur in, sandstones, limestones, and mudstones, we can analyse the environment and we can tell you that it's very similar to the environment on the bottom of today's ocean in shallow water. It's not exactly the same, but it's chemically similar and its temperature is about the same. So here we go. All these things are happily thriving in the Cambrian, but if we go up to the curve, the Cambrian had 4,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Well, that can't be right, can it? Greenpeace the oceans would boil away. Yes. Well, they didn't boil away. So that's the trend for carbon dioxide through time. It was very high then, and it clearly did not cause major warming. Doesn't mean it isn't a greenhouse gas. Yes, it is a minor greenhouse gas, but it doesn't cause catastrophic warming. And because I come from North Queensland, I'm allowed to fit a curve like that through. I mean, really. So now let's be a better scientist. Pretend I'm at the University of New South Wales with Matthew England now. And you'd agree that's a better fit. So now that raises an interesting question. What happened here? Clearly something happened between 350 and 450, between 450 and 350 million years ago. Something happened that sucked carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. You all know what it is. It's one of the great events in the evolution of life. What was it? The evolution of plants, land plants, and photosynthesis. So they're basically factories that take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, grow trees, and shrubs and grass, which other things can eat, and then when they die and collapse in appropriate conditions, they form a coal swamp, and along comes Gina Reinhardt, buys the license, digs up the coal, puts it in its power station, and our whole modern industrial society that we are so proud of, or should be, is based on cheap energy generated by coal-fired power stations. It's marvellous. And to deny it, this is one of the points I'll get to in a moment, to third world countries on the grounds that the carbon dioxide is damaging is completely immoral. Anyway, so we do that, and we burn it and power. What happens to the carbon dioxide? Well, it goes back. Isn't that where it came from in the first place? Well, of course it is. Am I missing something here? So we're burning something from the ground, and in doing so we release a beneficial gas that grows plants back into the atmosphere, and you want to call it a pollutant? You want to tax it? Literally, it is insane public policy. Insane meaning out of the rational mind. Okay. Now down here, the bottom part of that red dot is roughly 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution. The middle of the dot is where we are today. That's about 400 parts per million. And, you can't double it, says Greenpeace. Well, if we did double it and it was 560 parts per million, that would be the top. So that red spot encompasses all the recent and near future measurements of carbon dioxide. 280 parts per million, or even 390 or 560, indicates carbon dioxide starvation compared with the geological past. All these levels are suboptimal for plant growth, which is somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million in general for most plants. Why do tomato growers put carbon dioxide into their greenhouse in 1,000 parts per million? Because it makes them feel good? No, because it makes the tomatoes feel good. They grow better and they use less water, which is a critical thing for a country like Australia with arid zone agriculture. So 2 more myths. Atmospheric carbon dioxide is unusually high levels today. Every school child in Australia is taught that. It's a complete lie. More carbon dioxide will cause dangerous warming. I wouldn't term that a lie. It's a reasonable hypothesis to propose. I think back in the early 90s when the Greens first brought this up and said, well, mightn't the extra carbon dioxide cause dangerous? That was a good question to ask. But we've asked it, we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars researching it, and we now know the answer. And the answer is more carbon dioxide will not cause dangerous global warming. So I stress, those are just 2 science points. Stuart made a third. You've heard 3 empirical tests of the global warming alarmist theory. The theory is wrong. Moving to my 2 immorality points. This is an ABC website a few years ago. Prof. Fincke's greenhouse calculator. You can tell from the style that it's designed for 5 to 10-year-old children. So let's go over the page to the next page of the website. How big a greenhouse pig are you? Click on the question numbers across the top and select your answer for each one. The Australian average will be indicated. With each answer, see how your carbon dioxide production compares to the average Aussie greenhouse pig. That's most of you. The fellow with 2 SUVs, I don't know a name bad enough to call him. And to an environmentally sustainable little green pig. Okay, so here's the first of 11 screens. And each screen has a bunch of questions. How do you usually get around? The average user in Australia is car, light use of the car. But if you bicycle or walk or use the bus or train, that's the virtuous end of the scale. And the top end here is the naughty people. And as you choose in the particular box, this pig, which is you, will get bigger or smaller accordingly. Okay, so the child works his way through making these choices, and then he clicks on the what? He clicks on the skull and crossbones, and the screen explodes in a shower of blood. And a 7-year-old girl is told, you'll use your share of the planet's resources in 9 years. The ABC received hundreds of letters of complaint about this from all over the world. What do you think they did? Left it up. So I don't know the exact date it was taken down, but it was up there for 2 to 3 years. One of the letters read, I don't know where to begin except to say when we see things like this, we should complain loudly and incessantly. The ABC has crossed a line beyond science, beyond decency and beyond rational thought. Another letter said, this is child abuse. I stress, I've chosen one slide. I could give you a 40-minute lecture with examples starting in kindergarten, working up to this through secondary school, through to university, of indoctrination and propagandization of your children and grandchildren. It's been going on for 25 years. It's remorseless. It's immoral. Immoral action number 2 is spinning yourself senseless. This is a London policy research think tank, a bit like John's. And they did a report back in the 2006, Warm Words. How are we telling the climate story, and can we tell it better? It's a sort of intriguing title, isn't it? It is indeed. The task of climate change agencies, they say, is not to persuade but... how terribly old-fashioned. Instead, we need to work in a more shrewd and that's for sure, and contemporary way, using subtle techniques of engagement. The facts, no, they put facts in inverted commas, need to be treated as being so taken for granted they need not be spoken, like the fact that last year was the warmest ever, which actually meant in the last 150 years. It gets worse. Ultimately, that's the trouble with you lot, you need some positive climate behaviour. Needs to be approached in the same way as marketeers approach acts of buying and consuming. It amounts to treating climate-friendly activities as a brand that can be sold. And again, the Sydney Morning Herald is very good at that. This is, we believe, the route to mass behaviour change. Do you recall the last people in history that used that sort of language? Yeah. Well, who cares? Tin pot little left-wing think tank in London. I mean, who cares what they say? Well, who commissioned the report? Tony Blair and his spinmeister Alistair Campbell adopted this report as British government policy. Furthermore, through an organisation called the British Council, which in many other ways is a very meritorious organisation, they propagandised all the old Commonwealth countries. They were out here in Canberra, they were in Wellington, New Zealand, they were in Mumbai in India, and so on. There's a huge British diplomatic push, which is ongoing today, to propagate this stuff. It's pure propaganda. Spin, baby, spin. And we have our own exemplifiers of it. Well, global warming is a moral issue. That's where we've got to now, says Al Gore. He's right, but for exactly the wrong reasons. There are 1 to 2 billion people in the world, and these are some of them, who lack adequate sanitation, elementary education, clean drinking water, basic health services. The UN calculates for $60 billion a year, that problem could be fixed. Instead, the world is currently spending $1 billion a day, $60 billion a year, on global warming and alternative energy-related issues. Obscene amounts of money, and the opportunity cost is that these children and others like them not only are not able to develop, or their parents aren't able to develop their countries, but ultimately it leads to starvation and death. There's an American writer that has argued the policy on global warming of inhibiting coal-fired power stations is technological genocide. And the argument is it's the same as the DDT decision that many of you will know about, that the United Nations banned the use of DDT basically in third world countries for about 20 years. They rescinded it a couple of years ago, but in the meantime, hundreds of millions of people have died of malaria in third world countries. So technological genocide is the deliberate denial of use of a technological solution which will result in the deaths inevitably of many people. All that's necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing, and good women, don't think you're off the hook, ladies. The minimum you can do is join the IPA if you're not already a member. Okay, so I'm a great whinger, just ask my wife. But in points where we are at the moment, you can't just whinge about this. We all do it every day. It's deplorable what's going on around us, both in politics and in the media, on environmental issues. But what's the solution? We have to have a solution. And that solution, furthermore, has to be one that allows politicians to save face. They are so up to their necks and beyond in this stuff that there's no possibility of them just backing down. It will not happen. So I'm going to give you now two solutions. And the first one is going to happen anyway. Even President Obama adopted it last year, surprisingly, as I'll tell you. It is adaptation to all climate hazard. Doesn't matter whether it's caused by human activity or by natural activity. We clearly don't do as well as we should. 172 people died in the Victorian bushfires recently. Okay, now, we have magnificent firefighting services and so on, but we clearly could do things better, and that comes to climate hazard. Climate hazard is just one of a whole number of natural hazards. Let's go to New Zealand, and it's got active volcanoes, it's got big faults. This is the Wellington Fault running through Wellington Harbour. Government House sits right there. Isn't that a wonderful thought? And if we were to rank the natural hazard risks in New Zealand in order of increasing big costs and loss of life when they happen, earthquakes and volcanoes are right at the top, and they have floods and bushfires, but they're down the list. But of course, you come to Australia, we have no active volcanoes and only infrequent small earthquakes, and that is completely reversed. So the big risks in Australia are these ones, and these are lesser risks. Well, if you're the government of Australia and New Zealand, your sacred duty to your citizens is to plan for the risks within your own borders, to protect your own population. The idea that you'd notionally plan for a global world climate is just absurd. Absurd. So, these events, climate change, sea level rise, are just the same as these. They're unpredictable and they're unpreventable. So the thing you need to do is to plan better for them in advance, build resilience, build cyclone centres, build bushfire centres in Victoria and so on, and then when the event happens, adapt to it. The second thing we need is a way of de-Escherizing the opening slide picture. When a new Conservative government was elected in Denmark in 2001, it abolished more than 100 special interest government-supported advisory boards and councils, including about a dozen in the environmental field. At the same time, the incoming government created this institute you see here, and appointed Bjorn Lomborg as its founding director. An environmental assessment institute, effectively an audit institute for all proposals going to government that involve big environmental impacts. Calculations by the Ministry of Finance showed that prior to these actions being taken, Denmark was actually spending 3% of its GDP annually on environmental issues, which was the same as the health budget, and was way out of kilter. So, in America, back in 1963, an engineer called Arthur Kontranowicz put up a proposal for an institution for scientific judgment because it was becoming apparent, even in the 1960s, that the problem of scientists giving government the advice that scientists think the government wants to hear had already raised its head. And I'm going to give you a quotation from Dwight Eisenhower in his, when he resigned as president, retired as president, he said, "A steadily increasing share of modern research is conducted for, by, and at the direction of the federal government. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger. The public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite." How prescient. For that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what has happened, and that is exactly why the Danish government set up their Environmental Audit Institute, and it's exactly why Arthur Kontranowicz suggested setting up what came to be called a science court in the United States. 10 years after this paper, in 1976, there was a presidential task force looked at this, and they recommended indeed to proceed. The basic mechanism proposed is an adversary hearing. That's the problem at the moment, that you hear all the evidence for the prosecution for global warming, but nobody is funding the defence. You wouldn't put up with the court of law. There is no balance to the discussion. And it's not going to happen naturally with the media we've got, so you have to provide it from public funds. I hate the thought, I'm actually recommending here setting up a new bureaucratic organisation. Perish the thought. But if somebody can tell me another way of doing it, then I'm happy to do it. So the basic mechanism is an adversary hearing on, let's say, the Great Barrier Reef, open to the public, governed by a disinterested referee, there's an interesting animal, in which expert proponents of the opposing scientific positions argue their cases before a panel of scientific judges. Note, the judges themselves will be established experts in areas adjacent to the dispute. They will not be drawn from researchers working in the areas of dispute, nor will they include anyone with an organisational affiliation or personal bias that could influence their decision. So you could call this a science court in America. It didn't get up. Why didn't it get up? Because this trod on the turf of most of the big Washington bureaucracies. It was going to make them accountable, and so they organised themselves to defeat it. Exactly the same would happen here if we were able to get a proposal like this up to Canberra. The big government bureaucracies would fight it tooth and nail. I don't think many of you will know this, but we had our own audit commission for science and engineering. It was called ASTEC, Australian Science, Technology and Engineering Council. It was founded in the early 1970s by Malcolm Fraser. The council was composed of leading academics and industrialists, although scientists from other government agencies, notably CSIRO, were excluded. Just as in the US example, and you all understand, I don't have to explain why, okay? So now, what happened behind the scenes once this was set up? Yeah, CSIRO and other government agencies that were excluded beavered away remorselessly, and after 20 years they managed to talk the then government in 1997 to discontinuing ASTEC, so we no longer have it. What did ASTEC do? It was just like the Productivity Commission is for financial matters, so ASTEC is for major science, engineering and environmental matters. It is a body that has the government imprimatur to which the government refers problems it wants advice on. For example, ASTEC did a very good report on nuclear energy, which is still quoted and used around the world. Okay, 2 last slides. There is a need for a recognition that what I'm talking about is a systemic problem. It's right across the community. Every government department that tries to do something that involves development ends up within a couple of days falling foul of the Greens. Last week's example on Friday was Agribusiness Gippsland says climate change planning must start now. A new CSIRO report warns of impacts, including rising sea levels, hotter days, and 30% less rainfall over coming decades. It's not just one or another, it's all big environmental issues. There is a whole army of people out there and organisations that are professionally fighting any developments in Australia. For too long, green political interests have been allowed to get away with ceaselessly promulgating their unbalanced viewpoints under the umbrella of false or contrived science. Even just the existence of a government-backed audit agency like I'm recommending here, Aztec or a science court, would act greatly to temper the activities, because they would know somebody's going to be commenting on them. You actually also need a quicker on the feet type of organisation, which you might call an environmental advisory council, that can issue overnight, and that would be made up of a bunch of scientists, can issue overnight commentary on the sort of thing we've seen this week. The Academy of Sciences, John mentioned, and I have a slide I'll put up in response to a question in a moment. Academy of Sciences has just produced a report. Well, who's commenting on that? Well, the press is. They're pushing it. It's propaganda again. You need a group of independent scientists that within a day or two can actually issue sensible commentary on these various alarmist reports. Let me give you just one example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. If Captain James Cook was to sail up the Queensland coast today, out of sight of land, and you gave him modern measuring instruments, he would not be able to tell that it wasn't 1770 when he first sailed up there. I know, I've been there with the instruments and I've done the experiment. Okay? Yet despite that, in other words, the Great Barrier Reef's doing just fine, thank you, as 2 million tourist visitors a year will tell you. It's in best condition indeed of any coral reef tract in the world. Yet courtesy of remorseless green propaganda and boneheaded media support, hundreds of millions of people throughout the world think the Great Barrier Reef is being destroyed, and not least by carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. How can this be? It's a complete denial of reality, or rather the complete propaganda suppression of reality. The time is now due for the government to do something to introduce some mechanism by which green lobby groups are held to account. Mr. Abbott, being interviewed at the weekend by Andrew Bolt, said that Jay Weatherill, the Premier of South Australia, his decision to introduce an inquiry into the nuclear power industry represented a, quote, gale of common sense. Well, please write to Mr. Abbott and tell him that we need his gale of common sense, it's a very well-chosen phrase, as part of his reboot to fund a similar gale at federal level to deal with the global warming and other related environmental issues. Interesting graph here from America. These are the environmental laws they've passed. A bit of a trend there, you reckon? Stronger than any of Stuart's trends. Anyway, the cost of this is greater than 5% of the US GDP, and it will be similar in Australia. What's that number? It's about $1.7 trillion. Anybody know the size of the Australian economy? It's $1.7 trillion, roughly. So America is actually spending every year, in fact it's probably a bigger figure now because this ends in 1998, it is actually spending the same amount as the whole Australian economy on various environmental laws and regulations. Okay, so what can you do? You can help fight the spreading public mood of disenlightenment, as Nick Cater calls it, or endarkenment, as O'Neill calls it, in Australia. Firstly, you can argue vehemently for cost-effective Plan B of adaptation to all climate and weather events, however caused. and the book Taxing Air has got a section on that. Secondly, you can buy multiple copies of this book. I know you've all got one for yourself, but you've also got friends, relatives, children and grandchildren. So please buy 10 copies and give them away. And thirdly, please support the IPA. Thank you.